Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
Is it going on a year? Going on 2 years? I can't remember. We've been talking about Jewish ideas about God as that can filter into our own individual understandings of God while davening. We're talking now about Hasidut, early modernity. I think this is session number 3 about Hasidut. We talked first about, I always forget the word, Dveikut, right? Hasidism's concept that number one job and the foundational job is to try to be attached to God, cleave to God, Dveikut or Dveikus, and that this is something not like in a Rambam's way that you get to after a much deep, sophisticated study, but this is actually the beginnings, okay? And that this is something that is very, I'm going to put it in air quotes, easy to do or easy for anyone to do. You don't have to be sophisticated. You don't have to be deep. And then we talked about the words and the letters, and today we're going to continue with that. Not words and letters. We're going to continue with Hasidic ideas about prayer, and we're going to talk about their concept of Katnut and Gadlut, which Katan meaning small, Katnut means smallness, Gadol meaning big, bigness. Katnut and Gadlut. Actually, they shortened this from a concept in the Kabbalah called Mochin de Katnut or Mochin de Gadlut. Moach is the modern Israeli word for brain. Mochin means sort of mind in Kabbalistic Aramaic. So small mind or big mind. And this is where Hasidism starts to wrestle with the idea that it is sometimes hard when you're davening to maintain deep spiritual consciousness, even though that's the goal, but there's a recognition that it's hard to do that. The concept of Mochin de Katnut and Mochin de Gadlut in Kabbalah is a little broader than that. It's basically, can be applicable to so many things. In modern Israeli, they have a version of this. It's called Rosh Katan and Rosh Gadol, small-minded and big-minded. Even in a trivial way. Some guy cuts me off in traffic. Your Rosh Katan would say, small-minded view would be, he's a jerk, right? If it's a he. And Rosh Gadol would say, you know what? That person must be in a bigger hurry than I am. They must have a bigger need than I do. It's okay, right? So we can see things in let's call it limited field of vision or a broader field of vision. So obviously this, you can imagine, this can apply to so many different things. And there's a recognition in Kabbalah that, although we're trying to apprehend God and reach God, we are very often mired in our daily, limited, nose to the grindstone kind of concerns. So much of the time we are mired or stuck in Mochin de Katnut, small-mindedness, and it can be challenging to achieve. Let's call it. You can literally it's big-mindedness, and you can think of this as broad. When you say big, it could either mean broader or it could mean deeper. Okay, so now we're going to look at how Hasidism applies this to prayer. So first, some passages I told you last week that attributed to the Baal Shem Tov's own teachings about prayer, called Amud HaTfilah, the Pillar of Prayer, which you can purchase the whole book in English with great footnotes, which is stuck into the middle of the Baal Shem Tov's commentary on the Torah on Parshat Noach. And just to take you back to what we said last week, the reason it's in Parshat Noach is because of his metaphoric interpretation of Tzohar Ta'aseh La Teva, an illumination or a window you should make for the ark. And the double entendre, the teva in Rabbinic Hebrew, also means word. So Baal Shem Tov said this verse in Parshat Noach means the word, or the way we use language in sacred pursuits, which is study of Torah and in prayer. Those are the two things that were done in Hebrew, because all the speaking was done in vernacular, which was Yiddish. Okay, all the teaching was done in vernacular, which was Yiddish. So when you use the holy word in study or prayer, you're supposed to use it for purposes of deeper or greater illumination. And that is the launching off point for this whole mini book of the Baal Shem Tov, early 1700s, first half of the 18th century, talking about prayer. Okay, so bottom of the first page, which is called paragraph 30 in this edition. When you find yourself at a low level of inspiration, it is better to recite the prayer while looking into the Siddur, as by seeing the holy letters, you may gather energy to pray with more intention. I don't have focus on my davening. I don't have focus on God or aiming for dveikut. I'm distracted. I'm grumpy. I'm sleepy. Okay? Baal Shem Tov says, you daven then by looking at the words in the Siddur. Okay? Because you don't have inspiration. But when you are in conscious contact with the higher levels, or in more traditional rabbinic language, I think we would say, when you have kavanah, when you have good kavanah, you're able to daven with kavanah. Literally means intention, but I think in modern parlance we would say mindfulness. When you're able to daven with mindfulness, then it is better to close your eyes so that your mundane vision will not distract you from dveikut to the higher world. Dveikut, that concept we talked about in the first week, we talked about Hasidism, which means cleaving, sticking to, being attached to. Okay? So what this means is, his suggestion is, if there are davening words that you know by heart, let us say, for most of us, probably Shema and Ve'ahavta. Okay? Most of us probably know Shema and Ve'ahavta by heart, I dare say. Okay? If you're a really regular daily minyan goer. And some people know parts of the Amidah by heart. Okay? So if you do, meaning you don't need to read to know the words, and you are in a state of spiritual mindfulness, I can't define that better right this second, but he says there is such a state, then it's actually better to close your eyes. By the way, I'm gonna stop sharing by show of hands, although there are only a few people live with picture. How many of you sometimes have good concentration on your davening, and then you see something and you are distracted by that? Raise your hand. Right. I see someone walking into shul. Oh, you know what? I owe that guy an email. Or, oh, I haven't seen her for a long time. Or, 8 zillion other things. I guess for me, I just reveal that it's mostly seeing a person. But, during the Amidah, you see someone walking around and for all kinds of things that can be distracting. Okay? So the Baal Shem Tov says, look, if you have pretty good mindfulness, again, in rabbinic pre-Hasidic terms, it would be kavanah. But you feel like, okay, I'm achieving some dveikut, some spiritual cleaving to a higher realm, and you know the words, daven with your eyes closed, because it actually removes a potential disturbance. Okay, you're not on that level. You're not feeling that level. Read the words in the Siddur. That may actually help you deepen what you're trying to achieve. Okay. Notice in this passage, he does not say anything explicitly about Katnut or Gadlut. right? Smallness or bigness, small mind or big mind. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Next paragraph. The wise have eyes in their head. This is actually a quote. Hachacham einav barosho. Wise person means wise person walks around with their eyes open. I think it's from Proverbs in the Bible. So as to understand and observe if the time is opportune to cleave by means of the inner secret awareness and be in blissful contact with the spirit. And it is well to practice accordingly. Meaning, if you're a thoughtful person, the wise, you have your eyes open, which means you're on alert, okay? You can tell if you are in a good, mindful state. And then you practice accordingly. Let's say I'm reading the first line of the Shema. Of course, by the way, the sages assume everyone knows at least the first line of the Shema, because you're supposed that's why they tell you to cover your eyes, right? Everyone knows those six. Every regular Jew knows those 6 words, even if you're not a morning minyan attendee. So you certainly cover your eyes for that, to enhance concentration. But in general, a thoughtful person knows when they're in a more devekut, cleaving, mindful state of mind, right? They can tell. But if one observes oneself to be in a state of constricted consciousness, this would be a translation of Katnut, okay, or mochin de Katnut, constricted consciousness, unable to focus because distracting thoughts keep interrupting one's concentration. I have to go to work. How much money do I have in the bank account? Will that check clear? Blah, blah, all the things we worry about. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows we have distractions. Then one should pray like a simple child from the written text. This is as my teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, said about himself, that when he was this is very interesting, that when he was in a foreign land, he found himself in such a state, and that the expanded higher consciousness had left him for a time. I don't know if any of you experience this, but I experience when I am traveling and I am davening someplace unusual, like a hotel room or something like that, I don't feel as comfortable in my davening as when I am at home or in shul. You know, you get used to your zone. And I have more trouble with my davening is just not as good. It doesn't feel as meaningful to me. I'm a little distracted. I'm just a little off. Okay. So the Baal Shem Tov said, when I travel and I'm not in my zone, then it's harder for me to achieve my higher consciousness. And so at that point, he cleaved in his prayer attention to the holy letters. Okay. So at that moment, he opened his Siddur and he stuck with the words. Going down to the next page, called paragraph 41. When one is in constricted consciousness, in Katnut or mochin de Katnut, small mind, it should also be with great adhesion to the Shekhinah, the divine presence, right? It's not, okay, all I'm doing is reading words. Even when you're in small mind davening and you're just reading words, you should still try to experience yourself as trying to cleave to God's presence. Then, in one instant, one can think of the higher worlds and immediately find oneself in those higher dimensions. Higher dimensions here means deeper mind. I don't think it's not like a early Kabbalistic, like ascending to heaven vision. So that's not what it means. But you find yourself in deeper focus, deeper concentration, more spiritual focus. For in accordance where a person thinks, this is where one finds oneself. And if he or she would not be in the higher world, he or she would not have been able to think in that dimension at all. So sometimes we're in a lower mind state. By the way, next session, we'll talk a lot more about distractions. The Baal Shem Tov talks a lot about distractions and what they mean and what to do about distractions. Okay? We're not going to talk about that this week. But when you're in a smaller mind and you're just focusing on the words, try to use that focus on the words in a way to elevate or deepen your consciousness to a higher consciousness. Now, a couple of passages, one passage from one of these books, Your Word is Fire, which culls different selections from Hasidism on prayer and translates them into nicer, more poetic English. I'm going to put it that way. And this is actually also from the Baal Shem Tov, from the Tzava'at Haribash. The Tzava'at is his, he wrote a spiritual will, sort of, which he sent to his brother-in-law in Eretz Israel, I believe. And this is from that. And it's the last page on the handout. There are two rungs of service that a person can come to know. The first is called Katnut, the lesser service, or let's call it lower consciousness. Let's call it constricted mind, less mindful. In this state, you may know that there are many heavens encircling you, that the earth on which you stand is but a tiny point, and that all the world is nothing before the endless God. But even knowing all these things, you yourself cannot ascend. This is still the lesser service. It is of this state that the prophet says, from afar, God appears to me. Merachok Hashem nir'ali. I'm not sure what prophet that's from off the top. Okay? One of the prophets in the Bible. Meaning, okay, you know that God created the universe, all the theological stuff, you know that, you're aware of that, you're not in denial of that, but you do not feel, again, he doesn't explain exactly what this means, but even knowing all these things, you yourself cannot ascend. By the way, we might think of this in our terms as like, you have intellectual knowledge of these things, but you're not experiencing it on some spiritual level at this moment. Okay, it's more superficial, it's less deep, and that's what the prophet means when he says, God appears far off. There is God, I know God is there, looks very far. But when you serve in Gadlut, the greater service, or again, we would call, I think you might translate this, broader consciousness or deeper consciousness, you take hold of yourself with all your strength, and your mind soars upward, breaking through the heavens all at once, rising higher than the angels. Okay, I'm going to pause and stop the screen sharing. Did I stop the sharing? Yeah. Okay. So basically, let's take a sort of a step back from this to ask kind of, what are these concepts trying to address? I think they're trying to address a couple of things. One, it's hard to concentrate when you're daven. It's hard to have kavanah all the time. By the way, it does say, when you say the 6 words, the first line of the Shema, you're supposed to have kavanah. To enhance that, you're supposed to close your eyes, cover your eyes. Some shuls nowadays say it very slowly. By the way, traditionally in the halakha, you're supposed to say Shema aloud, and everyone says it at their own pace. If you go to a more traditional and Orthodox shul, it sounds like, I refer to it as like a fish market. Everyone is kind of saying Shema in their own way and at their own pace. Okay? There's some contemporary spiritual shuls where they say the Shema very slowly, aloud, but everyone in unison. Personally, I find this tyrannical, because if you really have kavanah, then you say Shema at whatever your pace is, not necessarily in unison. And that's just one of my many gripes about in life. I have so many of them. Okay. So it's hard to have kavanah. So one awareness, it's hard to have kavanah. It's hard to have all of davening feel spiritual. And that can mean within one 33 minute morning minyan, it's hard to maintain good concentration all the time. Some days it's easier or harder than others. Some moments in life, it's easier or harder than others. Many people who come to shul to say mourner's kaddish because they're grieving for someone, we'll be able to tell you yeah, there's some days where it's very deep and meaningful, and there's other days where it's just really hard to, you're just kind of going on autopilot and you're just having a harder time having it be meaningful. Okay. So I think this understanding kind of takes account of the human reality that we can't always have deep kavanah, or in Hasidic terms, we can't always have gadlut, deep consciousness. All right. When you do, this is the goal. Feel free to close your eyes. All right. When you can't, back to the page of the Siddur, and hopefully this will be a guide to bringing you deeper. But we acknowledge the reality that it isn't always, and sometimes you are just. I don't want to say. I don't like to trivialize it by saying going through the motions, but sometimes you're just doing what the rule says you're supposed to do, which is you're supposed to, daven these parts of the prayer book. They're required, all right? And you're not feeling it. Again, modern parlance, slang, right? I'm not feeling it. Sometimes you're feeling it. Sometimes you're not feeling it. It's an acknowledgement of that. By the way, it is still within the Jewish system, the Jewish halachic system, which clearly means even when you're not feeling it, you say the Shema, and you hope that gluing your eyes to the words on the page are a vehicle to going deeper, but the goal is to be feeling it. Okay. So I think it's about concentration and lack of concentration, which we'll talk about more next week. Distractions. I think it's also about acknowledging that sometimes we feel ourselves experience ourselves in a more mindful, spiritual level, more attuned. Again, I understand that I'm not defining these terms, spiritual level. I'm not defining that. I mean, the definition is having an easier time of cleaving to the Shekhinah, God's presence. And I'm not defining that. Okay? But sometimes we find ourselves more mindful, spiritually, more attuned, feeling we're more in touch with the divine. And a lot of times, and that's the goal all the time, but a lot of times we're just not. And it's an acknowledgement that is real and that is okay. And even the Baal Shem Tov himself said, when I'm on the road, I have a hard time experiencing that deveikud when I daven. It's just kind of how it is. Okay, I'm going to pause, allow a couple of minutes for question, comment, thought. Michael O.
I think it's interesting that in the text that you showed, when you're in that small state, you see God from afar, or you feel God from afar.
Yeah.
Whereas, you sort of think of the idea of in a more whatever spiritual state means or higher state, you think of God as that small voice near you, or
yes. Or in fancy theology books, they call this transcendent or immanent, IMMA, right? Meaning sometimes you feel God very close and you really feel, whatever that means, experience, feel, I don't know exactly. Again, we can't define that. And it's more intense. And that is a sense of Gadlut, deeper consciousness. Yeah. And there's times when it all seems very far off, very remote. I know what I'm supposed to believe and what I'm supposed to think, but I don't, it's not in my insides. I believe Kurt Vonnegut, Zal, the author, called this to grok something, Grok, in some of his novels. So sometimes, I don't quite grok it. I know it. I know what I'm supposed to think, but I just don't feel it. Again, feel is not exactly the right word either. Yeah. Larry. Sorry, I just want to say one more thing. And the goal is obviously deveikud. When God feels far off, it means I am not experiencing deveikud. Just how it is sometimes. Larry.
There's so many different levels to this.
Yes.
And I know that you want to talk about distractions next week.
Next week, distractions.
I understand.
Very explicitly about where distractions come from and what to do about them. A lot of
And
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to how much he foresaw the modern era and things like cell phones. But so today you want to talk about the internal distractions as opposed to the external distractions, I think.
Oh, he talks next week. Next week we're going to talk about internal distractions, because for him distractions means your thoughts.
So I don't know if this fits into today. These two thoughts that I'm having today. One is the difficulty of concentration and not having invasive thoughts of any kind.
Next week, invasive thoughts.
I hope he's a good psychiatrist. I know you are, so maybe you can help.
He's very thoughtful about the human psyche. That's what I'd say. You'll see. I promise.
Okay. So now, then let me address only one other of many issues, which is the issue of not so much mindfulness or kavanah, but simply comprehension.
Yeah.
So for a lot of us for whom Hebrew is not our mother tongue, and even if we understand Hebrew well enough that when we concentrate, we understand Hebrew, there can be a roteness in reciting the words, which as a child, I remember even in English, the Pledge of Allegiance had no meaning. It was just a string of words that we put together. And Hebrew can be that. And so for me, at least, and I don't know whether this is something that's recommended for anybody else, it's necessary for me to have some triggers or signals that bring me back to the meaning. And I only say, those of you who have davened with me, you know that there are phrases that I say aloud, at least to myself, and maybe to your distraction, and if so, I apologize. And there are also a few other things, that the bowing that we all do, but there are a few other motions that I make myself. I've taken to my own davening, which brings to me the meaning, and I hope the understanding of what the words are supposed to mean for me. Sorry to be redundant about that. So maybe some of you will see that I actually move my hands or beat my heart in places that other people don't. Because to me, the words maybe talk about it shall impact upon your heart, on your heart. And so I go like that, so that when I'm davening, it brings to mind. And so I'm not proud of the fact that I do this, because I would rather that I understood it when I was saying the prayers. But I need something else. I need a third thing, or whatever it is. I need another thing to get me to be aware of what that is, until those things become rote. And when they become rote, the purpose is defeated.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to rephrase what Larry said, and I'm going to wrap up with that. I'm going to rephrase it as a suggestion, several suggestions. Number one, if you'd like to understand the Siddur better, then take a class in Siddur Hebrew, or get a Siddur with a clear, some people daven with a Siddur with a clear interlinear translation. A lot of Siddur Hebrew is repetitive Hebrew vocabulary. Okay. Second, Larry, you gotta mute. Sorry. Hello. Hi, sweetie. Hi. Second, because it's hard to concentrate all the time and penetrate the Hebrew all the time, a good sort of suggestion that Larry is making indirectly is have a few phrases that you grok better, that you really understand, Hamechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid maaseh breshit, the next to last line of the first bracha of the Shema, who renews every single day creation by means of God's beneficence. Okay, so, right, Tov, Breshit, Mechadesh from Chadash, right? So there are a few, right, relatively familiar, simpler Hebrew words for a lot of people, right? So have some lines that help you, that you use as, I don't know what to call it, anchor points or something, or hooks that help you deepen, okay? So again, the obvious one is the Shema, but then develop your own list, little by little, of phrases that help bring you deeper. I also want to point out, you're allowed to daven in any language. I've said to lots of people, the people come to Morning Minyan and read the books of poetry, because they say the words of the Siddur mean nothing to me. And I always suggest it. Okay, the first blessing is about nature. So why don't you, here's my encouragement. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu Olam, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei et hakol. Then read your poem about nature, and then say Baruch atah Hashem Yotzer hameorot. Okay? So there's a structure which is fairly easy to comprehend, which if you go back in Siddur class, I mean, I know not everyone's been here forever, but we've gone through the whole Siddur 3 times before we got up to this cycle. There are plenty of books about this, right? You know, learn the bare bones framework and then insert your own spiritual, meaningful thing into it. Okay, so there are all kinds of ways of doing this. And this is where it's important, where you either figure that out on your own or you take a Siddur class, or you attach yourself to a rabbi and go meet with the rabbi and say, please, here's where I'm at, and tell me a couple of suggestions about how I get to the next, air quotes, deeper step or Gadlut. Okay, I got to ring off for today. Thanks for joining us. Next week, God willing, I don't think there's anything interfering on Tuesday as far as I know, and we will talk about internal distractions. Baal Shem Tov on internal distractions, where they come from, why we have them, and how to deal with them. So thank you. Be Torah. Stay healthy.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.